Voters here in Turkey will head to the polls on May 14 in what is widely seen as the country's most consequential presidential and parliamentary elections in recent history.
It's impossible to get the region back on its feet in such a short time. I think Erdoğan knows that himself.
The opposition win, I think we'll see the West reach back out to Turkey, try to bring it back into the fold of the EU. There'll be a love fest.
Erdoğan has given no sign so far that he's going to backtrack this. He basically says that we're going to fix it. How? We have no idea.
We shouldn't lose hope, because it's in our hands to change it.
Merhaba and welcome to this business special on this Sunday's Turkish elections. I'm Julia Hahn in Istanbul and I'll help you get up to speed on the state of the country's economy, what the candidates are promising, with a view from the ground and some expert analysis. Let's begin with a staggering reconstruction bill after a series of devastating earthquakes which struck the country's southeast from early February on. 11 provinces have been affected by the disaster. We went to Adıyaman, one of the cities worst hit by the quakes, where entire businesses literally collapsed. Ahmet Selim's factory lies in ruins. The textile workshop he managed in Adıyaman had only opened 1.5 years ago. It was destroyed within minutes in February's earthquakes.
The roof of the middle hall completely collapsed. That was a big shock, of course. At least it didn't happen during working hours, so people weren't here. We used to have 150 employees and sell many of our products abroad, mostly children's clothing.
Nothing can be saved here. The remains of the building have to be demolished. Selim estimates the financial damage at 7 million euros. And he's convinced that things needn't have been so bad.
This happened due to serious negligence. The building inspectors didn't check the construction company, and the ministry officials didn't keep tabs on the building inspectors. There has been a whole chain of negligence systematically from the ministry to the contractor.
There are many like Ahmet Selim here in the quake-hit region. Hundreds of thousands of buildings were destroyed or damaged. Entire businesses have literally collapsed. Millions of people fled the earthquake zone. The UN estimates the economic cost will exceed 90 billion euros. President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan has pledged help. His promise shortly before the elections, a reconstruction program of historic proportions.
God willing, we will completely heal the wounds caused by the disaster in 11 provinces. By building a total of 650,000 new houses, 319,000 of which will be delivered in 1 year.
Economist Emrah Lafçı is skeptical about these announcements. In the last 2 decades, Erdoğan has launched multiple state-subsidized construction projects to boost the economy. But the country can no longer afford this.
It's impossible to get the region back on its feet in such a short time. I think Erdoğan knows that himself. The earthquake damage is as big as 10% of our GDP, and you can't just shoulder that easy. Turkey needs foreign investment for this. Otherwise it won't work.
But that's precisely the problem, Lafçı says. Erdoğan has made many decisions that scared away foreign investors in recent years. He has restricted the independence of the judiciary, of the central bank and the media. He's turned away from partners in the West and towards autocratic leaders in Russia and the Middle East. All of this could now come back to haunt him.
Erdoğan makes all decisions alone, and he doesn't let anyone tell him that he might make mistakes. That's our biggest problem at the moment. If Erdoğan wins the election and continues these policies as before, Turkey will be even worse off than it is right now.
mevcut durumundan daha kötü hale getirecektir.
In Adıyaman, in the earthquake zone, many share these concerns. Some shopkeepers have reopened their stores amidst the rubble and dust.
There are no customers. They have either died or fled elsewhere. Not even a handful of people come here per day to buy something.
Sales are down. Our shop was destroyed. We saved what we could. And now we are just trying to sell what is left and make a living somehow.
We reopened 10 days after the earthquake. We must continue and hold on to life. There is no other way.
Erdoğan's main challenger in the presidential election, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, represents a six-party opposition alliance. He has promised to reverse Erdoğan's unorthodox economic policies, restore the independence of institutions, and bring back parliamentary democracy. Nevertheless, some are cautious about the prospects of the opposition alliance.
Şimdi bu 6 partinin
For Turkey, such a six-party government would be something completely new.
örneği daha önce bizim görmediğimiz bir örnek. Muhalefet.
If the opposition wins the elections, it will first have to prove that it can actually work together without constant bickering among themselves.
Kadrolarını hem bize, Türkiye'ye hem dünyaya göstermesi gerekiyor. Bunu bekliyoruz.
In quake-hit Adıyaman, Ahmet Selim is trying to save his business. He has rented a hall next to his collapsed factory. Here he can keep at least a few of his employees working. But can he rebuild his business? Will he get financial support or be left with a huge mountain of debt? Right now, Selim has a lot of questions, but doesn't feel he's getting answers.
Politicians and officials come here, they take pictures, but then they leave and we get nothing out of it. What will happen to us? There is uncertainty everywhere, not just with us. There are many companies here that feel exactly the same way.
Some of his fellow entrepreneurs have already given up, but Ahmet Selim wants to try to stay in business. He hopes that the reconstruction in his hometown will progress quickly, that people will return to Adıyaman, that there will be work here again, and a future. An example there of how people have been impacted by recent events and the state of the economy hasn't helped. It's a concern not just in the earthquake-hit areas, but across the country. We took to the streets here in Istanbul and asked people how important the economic issues are for them in this election.
A lot of people, especially the young ones like me, like beginning of the 20s, they are just waiting for voting. They are just waiting 14 on May because everyone just gets bored about the system.
People with lower income are in especially great distress in Turkey because of high inflation. Many people are struggling to get by month by month. They're struggling to pay their rent. The most important issue in this election right now is the economy.
The economy is a very important issue for our country right now. It is also very important for young people, especially for us students. For example, we are about to graduate and we cannot dream about the future as we want, because we are dependent on everything they will do.
People can't buy what they want. They can't afford hobbies or other aspirations. Year by year, the hopes of us young people are diminishing. It's bad, but it can be fixed. We shouldn't lose hope, because it's in our hands to change it.
The views of ordinary people in Istanbul there, the economy clearly a key concern for them. But what do the candidates have to say about it? Let's get more from my colleague Kate Ferguson in our Berlin studio.
Thanks, Julia. Let's bring in DW reporter Akram Akici now. Akram, whoever wins this election inherits a very deep economic crisis. I want to look at Recep Tayyip Erdoğan first. He has been pursuing very unorthodox economic policies, you could say. While the rest of the world has been raising interest rates to battle inflation, he has been lowering them. If he wins again, can we just expect more of the same?
Yes. That's the short answer. So he gives no sign that he's going to backtrack this policy that he has been following since almost 2 years now. And he stands firm behind this economic policy that he says is going to work eventually. As you have seen, there's a drop in inflation, which the analysts say because of the base effect. And we were talking about last year around here, we were talking about 86%, and now it came down to 43%, which is still a lot. And he and his economic team advertised this as like, you see, it's working. And that's actually not working. We see it on the ground. We see everywhere we go in Turkey, and families suffer, basically. And an independent inflation research group say that like it's still over 100% in real life. And yeah, Erdoğan has given no sign so far that he's going to backtrack this. He's going to go back to conventional economic policies, and he just defends it still, and he says it's going to work. So he basically says that we're going to fix it. How? We have no idea.
Okay.
With the same unorthodox way.
All right. So let's look at the possibility of change then. The opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, what is he promising?
He's basically promising first reinstating the strengthened parliamentary system and abolishing the presidency system, where you look at the word coming from the mouth of one man. And he promises to go back to, how do you say that, rational economic policies, meaning hiking interest rates and driving up foreign direct investments in Turkey, and yeah, ramping up the investment and focusing on fixing the crazy high inflation levels. So basically, this is what he promises, and we will wait and see on Sunday if this is gonna work, if he's gonna win. But no matter what happens, it looks like it's gonna take at least 6 months that you feel the effects of a possible opposition victory in Turkey, in terms of economic sense.
Sure. Now, I want to end with a personal question. You have family and friends in Turkey. How are they coping with this really, what we can say, crazy cost of living crisis?
They can't, basically. No family in Turkey can cope with this type of economic reality by only doing what they do all the time. They keep reducing, they keep cutting from their lifestyles, they keep cutting from even basic stuff like food. And in terms of young people, that we see that a lot of outward migration of large amounts of skilled labor, and because people don't see future, young people don't see future, as we see everywhere in interviews and street interviews. When you question them in polls, they say, "Yeah, I don't have a future in Turkey, and I'm gonna look elsewhere to find a decent life," basically. So it's basically a very sad picture of hopelessness. And yeah, everybody is looking into that election. People in Turkey are fixated to this, and yeah, there's a large section of society that wanting that change.
All right, so the stakes of this election could hardly be higher. Akram Akici, thank you so much for your insights. And it's back to Julia in Istanbul now.
Thanks for that, Kate. And earlier I spoke with Timothy Ash. He is an economist covering Turkey at RBC Blue Bay. And I started by asking him for his assessment of the current state of the Turkish economy.
Well, under Erdoğan, it's been a decade of stop-go economic cycles, high growth, but overheating, which has meant high inflation, large trade deficits and current account deficits, which put pressure on the exchange rate, devaluation, and then feed through to inflation. Very unorthodox policies by Erdoğan. Doesn't like high interest rates, very negative real interest rates, That hasn't been a defence for the currency. So very challenging, actually. I mean, the economy is it's amazing that Turkey's actually avoided a systemic crisis, I think, despite these kind of perennial kind of balance of payments and currency kind of crises. But actually the banking sector has been pretty resilient. It hasn't been a sovereign debt crisis yet. But I guess post-election, people question, what's going to happen? Is it going to be sustainable? How Erdoğan, if he wins, is going to manage the challenging balance of payments kind of issues without doing the right kind of thing in terms of raising interest rates?
So how significant is this election, would you say, in particular for the future of the country? Are we looking at two completely different economic visions for Turkey?
Well, hugely important elections from a political and economic perspective. Politics, it's autocracy, I guess, a different model of political development, more a Central Asian model versus, Western liberal market democracy. If the opposition win, I think we'll see the West reach back out to Turkey, bring it back into the fold of NATO and the EU. There'll be a love fest, I guess, between the West and Turkey again. And from an economics perspective, the opposition have a very orthodox economics team, very well known, respected. Ali Babacan, former AKP Minister of Finance, former Deputy Prime Minister under the AKP, but he did a lot of the difficult adjustment 20 years ago as Finance Minister. Also, again, other people in the team the market knows and respects. They've suggested they'll go back to orthodoxy. So basically, they'll raise interest rates to fight inflation. They'll have a more flexible exchange rate regime. They'll clear out the central bank and go back to some independence in terms of monetary policy and in terms of the team at the central bank, new governor probably. And I think the market will like that. So likely they'll see a lot of capital inflows that will help stabilize the currency. And eventually, hopefully inflation will moderate. They'll be able to cut rates ultimately. And that you can paint a relatively positive picture there. If Erdoğan wins, as I mentioned, the question just is how sustainable is the balance of payments when the guy at the top, tells the central bank that it can't use the most important tool for central bankers, which is the ability to use interest rates to demand manage the economy. If they're not able to use interest rates, either the currency has to adjust, they have to introduce capital controls, or they have to get some new financing from abroad. Doesn't want to go to the IMF, so it's whether or not the Gulf states or Russia are willing to write big checks to defend the currency and sustain the macro without a balanced payments crisis.
Now, if we take a step back, help us understand, how did inflation get so high? I mean, we've seen 85% at some point last year, according to official data. Some say President Erdoğan's unorthodox economic policy is to blame. But is there more to that than this?
Not really. Look, I mean, I think there is obviously a global problem with inflation, right? So, if you look at the UK, Western Europe, most emerging Europe, I mean, inflation is generally in the 10% around that level. Maybe some countries maybe as high as 20. No one has seen inflation in the region up to 80%. So a significant part, I'd say 3/4 at least, of the inflation in Turkey is absolutely due to the macro and particularly monetary policy stance of President Erdoğan himself, right? And he's gone for growth. He's valued growth over fighting inflation. As I said, he has a problem with interest rates, which makes it very difficult for the central bank to manage the economy. With very, very negative real interest rates, people don't want to hold lira. That means continuous selling pressure on the lira, devaluation. If you think back in a decade or so ago, the lira was at 2 to the dollar. It's close to 20 now, and as you've seen that devaluation, that means pass through to inflation. I guess exchange rate pass through is the biggest factor driving inflation. It's absolutely because of the unorthodox policies being pursued by the central bank.
And then he has promised to bring inflation back down to single digits. That's one of his campaign promises. Can Erdoğan do that?
I mean, very, very hard unless, his track record is very poor. He's been in power 20 years. There was only once over that period where the inflation target of 5%, the inflation target. So at the moment they're close to 10 times that. Only once in 2011, I think they met the 5% target. So his track record is very poor. And again, he shows, unless he's willing to go back to orthodoxy and do a 180 degree in terms of his monetary and economic policy kind of mantra, I just don't see how it can be done. I mean, essentially, Erdogan has to accept a period of a lot less growth, domestic deflation, lower demand, to actually have any impact on inflation. And Erdogan is almost constant in an election cycle. After these elections this year, even if he wins, there's local elections next year. They'll be difficult. They're important. So I don't see much to suggest that he's willing to give up a bit of growth to make headway in terms of winning on the inflation front. And most people think that in any event, whoever wins the election, the lira probably has to weaken after the election. And that again means more exchange pass-through. So obviously the base is high at the moment for inflation. So inflation is beginning to moderate. But I don't think there's much to suggest in my mind that we're going to get anywhere close to single digits. If anything, I think we may see inflation beginning to go up again as the currency adjusts after the election.
Because if we look at Erdogan's first 10 years in power, they were quite different, right? I mean, we saw rapid economic growth. He was seen as the leader who lifted millions of people out of poverty. Why did he pivot away and towards this more unorthodox and very controversial economic policy? What happened there? Do you have an explanation for that?
Well, you're right. I mean, the first decade was a decade of stabilization, of success, high growth, lower inflation, investment grade rating. Investors liked the story. They loved the story. But it was very orthodox policy, right? They had a good central bank governor or governors over that period. They were using interest rates as a tool of monetary policy. They also had a backstop of an IMF program earlier in that period, and also an EU accession angle as well going on. I think the second decade, what happened was the concentration of power. If you talk to people around Erdogan's always had these views on interest rates. I think it's based on faith. He has a religious aversion to usury, and that's one of the angles driving the unorthodox policy. They tell you that he's always had those views, but actually the team was very broad and diverse in the first decade, and there were checks and balances, and other people within the team, Ali Babacan, I've mentioned already, was part of that team, and they stopped Erdogan doing the things that he actually wanted to do, which was cut interest rates in line with his sort of unorthodox monetary views. The second decade it's really been about unorthodox policy, and that's the difference, I think. If you take the interest rate tool away from a central bank, it becomes very, very difficult for it to manage inflation and actually the exchange rate, and that's actually what's happened.
I would like to turn to the earthquake disaster. Can the government effectively shoulder the costly burden of reconstruction? We're talking about billions and billions of dollars or euros.
Well, yes, big cost, clearly. The positive is, the one plus about the Erdogan AKP administration is public finances have been run generally pretty well. Public sector debt is only around 30% of GDP. That's the envy of most EU member states. So there is fiscal space, I think, to spend in terms of earthquake recovery. Obviously, recovery in the short term anyway will likely boost import demand. So maybe put extra pressure on the trade deficit, and then the lira will possibly weaken with all those imports coming in for the rebuild. But from a fiscal stance, yes, it is possible. Although, again, the costs are huge. And obviously, Turkey, a move back to orthodoxy from a monetary point perspective would, I think, open up Turkey back to Western capital markets, and that will see capital inflows, which will reduce the cost of money or borrowing for Turkey and help them in terms of the reconstruction.
So foreign investment would be absolutely necessary as well.
Yes, unfortunately. You mentioned that first decade of AKP rule. That saw a peak of foreign investment in local lira assets, bonds and equity of about $130 billion. In the last decade, that's dropped to around $20 to $30 billion. So a lot of money's left. Foreign investors generally don't have faith in the monetary policy settings. If we saw a return to orthodoxy in terms of policy, either with the opposition winning the election or actually Erdoğan winning the election and moving back to orthodoxy, I think you'd see those foreign inflows come back into the country, and I think that would certainly help with the reconstruction needs of the country.
So how does Erdoğan's report card look like for the past 20 years?
Well, you know, Erdoğan has achieved many positive things. I mean, I think, you know, I first came to Turkey in 1987. I've covered Turkey for 20 odd years. That first decade was very successful. You mentioned, you know, high growth, low inflation, reduced poverty, living standards improved, huge strides were made in terms of infrastructure, building of hospitals, schools. People generally will see those as positive things. I think, unfortunately, the second decade has been about macro instability, and I think that's detracted from some of the positive things Erdoğan did during his first term. Macro instability, devaluation and high inflation. And actually, high inflation hurts everyone. You know, high growth is good for, you know, most people don't feel high growth, but everyone feels inflation. And I think it'll be interesting whether that counts in this election, whether actually the weak macro performance that we've seen, you know, over the past decade, and particularly over the last few years, as reflected in high inflation, will ultimately hurt Erdoğan in the election itself.
Let's talk a bit more about the opposition. What are they bringing to the table in this election, and can they fix the economy?
Well, their message is, you know, a return to normalcy, orthodoxy. We know what to do on the macro. It's again, hire a decent central bank governor, decent central bank team, good economy team, and, you know, don't try and reinvent the wheel. Let's do simple things. Policy rates need to be hiked. Currency needs to find its own level. Erdoğan is, you know, because the central bank's not been able to use the interest rate tool. I mean, they've done lots of macro-prudential things in the banking that are really, really complex, and they've messed around in markets, which have been, it's really unhealthy, I think, overall. So I think the opposition is saying, you know, we're going to return to a proper functioning market economy. And I think that it's also going to be about checks and balances, rule of law, and meritocracy in terms of appointments. So trying to get the right kind of people in the right places. So that's kind of the message. For me, the challenges for the opposition really are about the politics of it, in terms of it's a six-party ruling coalition. It could well be dependent in parliament on the ethnic Kurdish party, the HDP, for its majority. That could be quite tricky, holding that coalition together. So I think on the macro, the messaging is very good. Also, you know, it'll be about normalization in the relationship with the West, as I mentioned. That could well bring a lot of capital inflows as the West re-engages with Turkey, and then that's a positive. But the concern on the opposition front is simply the diverse nature of the coalition, and will it be durable?
How much time would that take? Do we have any idea about the time frame? Some also say it might first have to get worse until it finally gets better for the Turkish economy.
Look, they'll have to implement some painful measures. You know, policy rates from 8% may well have to go to 40%. They'll have to accept some slower growth in the short term to fight inflation. There'll be skeletons likely in the cupboard that they'll find. You know, there'll probably be question marks about the balance sheets of the state-owned banks. There are some public-private partnerships that may have some hidden costs for the budget. There's this FX protected deposit scheme also that, you know, there's around $100 billion now in this scheme that basically depositors are compensated for devaluations. If they have to let the currency adjust, that will impose a big burden on the fiscal space. So, but as I said, I mean, the starting point is a low budget deficit, a low public sector debt GDP ratio. There's some space for them to absorb those potential losses, etc., that are revealed after the election. But certainly the first year will be quite difficult, I think, for the population. And as I mentioned, there are local elections coming due next year. I sense from the opposition that they'll kitchen sink everything early in their rule. They'll get everything out the way soon. They'll hike rates very aggressively early, and they'll let the currency adjust probably to a more competitive level, again, very early in their administration, which gives them a chance of some recovery before those local elections.
A very decisive election indeed, and one of the tightest ones according to polls. Timothy Ash, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights.
My pleasure.
The cost of living crisis in Turkey has hit people in all kinds of ways. But for those who were already struggling, it's the growing price of food that tops the list of concerns. My colleague Dorian Jones has this report right here from Istanbul.
It's an early start for Yusuf Kahveci to bring his produce to this Istanbul market. For farming companies like Kahveci's Akasya Agricultural, it's a struggle for survival amid soaring inflation. In October, it reached 85%. As Turkey heads to the polls, the state of the economy will be decisive for many voters.
Last year, diesel prices were more reasonable. When I rented a tractor, it was 150 to 200 lira per acre. Now they charge 1,000 for the same piece of land.
Kahveci says customers are buying less. He used to sell out by 1 p.m. Now he's lucky to finish by 5. But for some in Istanbul, high prices are more than just an inconvenience. They're an existential threat. The Istanbul charity, Deep Poverty, helps those in greatest need. The group warns soaring rents have forced many into shanty dwellings, and even the spectre of malnutrition now hangs over the city.
Now, it's very hard to find even the food. For instance, we see that the women, again, asking for food for their kids, it's increased so much. And baby formula, they are asking for that, this baby food, and because now they cannot buy a baby formula, even the modest, cheapest ones, so they are trying to feed their kids with water, with sugar.
Seda Özdemir and the rest of the Deep Poverty team face the heartbreaking choice of deciding who receives aid and who doesn't. Tackling poverty will be a tough challenge for whoever wins the election, as the cost of living crisis continues to bite.
And that's all we have time for now on this special edition of DW Business on the upcoming elections here in Turkey. I'm Julia Hahn in Istanbul. Thanks for watching and goodbye.